David Smith is our presenter today, and he went from Yale University as an undergrad to Columbia Medical School, and then I forget about the internship, but
me too.
We're together. He's here with us now, and then is going to be doing a fellowship at the Oxford Clinic in New Orleans in MRI.
Mm-hmm.
And his topic is going to be the history of anatomic inquiry from
Well, thanks for coming. Appreciate all y'all being here. I'm going to ask, mostly because Leon came in, that we save all the questions and comments until after the talk. My world record for shortest presentation I've ever given on a subject like this is 1 hour and 45 minutes, and Rita would be mad at me if I went that long. So we'll have some time at the end, and we'll talk through some the questions that y'all have. Now, anybody who knows me knows that I'm probably going to start with some etymology. And our word anatomy comes from a Greek prefix and a Greek root. The prefix is ana, which simply means up, as you can see in these transliterations of Greek words. And the root is tom or tem, which simply means to cut. So anatomy just literally means to cut up. Now, of course, time prevents me from going into a lot of detail. It's important to remember that the study of anatomy is inseparable from physiology, medicine, surgery, etc. So even though I'm sort of going to be talking about people who make anatomic discoveries, there's all this other research going on at the same time. Unfortunately, I won't be able to talk about it, but just remember that it's there. In many ways, the progress that people made with respect to anatomy mirrors the progress of world history, of political history and intellectual history. And we have these convenient, if arbitrary, eras that I'm going to go through because I can. It'll just make it a little bit easier. And I think to fail to consider the political and cultural things that were going on at the time of these discoveries would be sort of to miss the point a little bit. So we'll start at the beginning. Of course, from the times that hominids evolved, they were cutting up their prey. They were cutting them up to eat, to sacrifice, to try to predict the future. Often this role was designated to the wise man, the shaman, the priest. And of course, naturally, with exposure, people became familiar with basic anatomy, basic organs, of course, surface anatomy. But they probably lack the sort of systematic understanding that we like to think that we have. Of course, early surgical specimens suggest that maybe they did know a little bit about what they were doing. We'll really never know. Early Asian civilizations in the Indus Valley and in China had some health medicinal theories akin to humoral theory, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And they were interested in remedies and so forth, but there wasn't a lot of anatomic sophistication. The early Mesopotamian civilizations also probably lacked sophisticated anatomic understanding, but they don't leave us a lot of records, so it's hard for us to say. Now we're talking about, 3 to 4,000 BC here. This is an example of a sheep liver model, which was excavated from a Babylonian settlement. So this is a civilization that came a little bit later, talking around 2000 BC. And so this is a sheep liver model. You see in cuneiform the description of different parts of the liver. There's probably a gallbladder and so forth. So the cuneiform style actually predates when this was excavated. So some people think that it may have come from an Elamite society, which would date it several hundred or maybe 1,000 years before the layer it was excavated in 2000 BC. So we're going to have to move to ancient Egypt before we reach any understanding of human anatomy. Of course, the ancient Egyptians practiced mummification, from which they probably didn't get a lot of anatomical understanding. They obviously had to do some procedures and so forth, but it doesn't seem like they had a great understanding of what they were going through. There's a large body of medicinal texts which deal with traumatic injury and the anatomy associated with that. There's also a lot of magical and herbal cures that are discussed, but some of these do demonstrate some pretty sophisticated, at least for the time, knowledge of human anatomy. There are two papyri that are the most famous for being medical papyri, named for their discoverers. There's the Edwin Smith papyrus, which dates to at least 1700 BC, although some scholars think that it probably is a copy of an earlier work that came some 700 or 800 years earlier from the Third Dynasty, and some people even speculate that Imhotep was the author. I think that's going a bit far, but anyway, it's a very old document. And then there's the Ebers papyrus from the 16th century BC. The Edwin Smith papyrus is the first document that talks about the cranial sutures, the meninges, and CSF, and it discusses the heart, blood vessels, the liver, spleen, kidneys, ureters, and bladder. It also says that vessels were connected to the heart and go to every part of the body. Seems obvious, but not necessarily. The Ebers papyrus contains a treatise on the heart, and it says that the heart is the center of the blood supply, which is important because that wasn't always thought to be true, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. There were civilizations that were contemporaneous with ancient Egypt in the Near East. We have literally documents of letters going back and forth from heads of state asking for instance, there's a Hittite prince who became sick, and we have the letters that were sent to Egypt saying, "Can you please send me a physician? My son is sick." And there was a lot of transfer of information in that way. So although most of our documentary evidence comes from Egypt, probably because of the arid climate and because things were preserved, certainly there are a lot of things going on in these other places which don't come down to us, but there was definitely talk between all these people and transfer of information. So we're going to move on to the Greeks, and I'm going to talk about pre-Alexandrian and post-Alexandrian Greeks for reasons that will become clear later. That is, the Greeks that lived before the conquest of Alexander the Great and those that came afterwards. It's important to remember that pre-Alexandrian Greeks could not practice human dissection for religious purposes. The desecration of the body was one of the worst things you could possibly do, so all of the dissection was on animals. And of course they also learned anatomy through trauma and so forth, but as far as the systematic study, that was all done on animals. We're going to start with Homer, the blind poet, the composer of Iliad and Odyssey, lived in the 8th century BC. Iliad is full of battle scenes, which is one of the reasons why I love it. And most of them go something like this. Idomeneus stabbed Erymas in the mouth with the pitiless bronze, so that the brazen spearhead smashed its way clean through below the brain in an upward stroke, and the white bones splintered, and the teeth were shaken out with the stroke, and both eyes filled up with blood, and gaping he blew a spray of blood through the nostrils and through his mouth, and death and a dark mist closed in about him. That's how most of them go. And it's easy to say, gosh, this is violent, and what can you learn from it? But in these sorts of scenes, up to 147 different specific body parts are discussed in Iliad. They talk about anatomy of the eye, the respiratory system, digestive system, of course a lot of musculoskeletal terminology is there. Now listen to this scene from Book 8. Now Teucer had drawn from his quiver a bitter arrow, and laid it on the string. But just as he was drawing it back, Hector of the flashing helmet struck him, beside the shoulder, where the collarbone parts the neck and the chest, and the nerves broke, and his hand grew numb at the wrist, and he fell on his knees and remained there, and the bow fell from his hand. Here's the operative sentence. Notice some of these words. And the nerves, neuren, broke, and his hand, narkese, fell asleep, epicarpo, at the wrist. So this is obviously a description of the brachial plexus. The knowledge in Homeric times of anatomy was as sophisticated as in Hippocratic times, which is a few hundred years later, which isn't surprising because Hippocrates was more interested in surface anatomy than internal anatomy. Hippocrates was at least the popularizer, if not the inventor, of humoral theory, which maintained that there are 4 basic substances: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, and that health is created when there is a balance between these substances, and when there's an imbalance you have disease, and the particular disease depends on the imbalance. Hippocrates was more of a diagnostician and treater of ailments than an anatomist. At the time, there was no distinction between nerves, tendons, and ligaments. There was also no distinction between blood vessels. He does mention lymph nodes in a single line of one of his works. But he didn't just know obvious anatomy, liver, femur. They talked about bony landmarks that aren't necessarily that obvious. The term acromion, olecranon was used. They talk about the mandibular coronoid process, and so forth. So there's getting to be a pretty sophisticated degree of understanding, at least of bony anatomy. As much as it hurts me to do this, I'm going to skip over the entire Golden Age of Athens and move to Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BC. Aristotle certainly was one of the great minds in the history of the Western world. He defined and treated most of the subject matter that constitutes the academic repertoire up until today, so clearly there's a turning point coming. Again, he could not dissect humans, but he systematically dissected animals, dozens and dozens of species, so he was really the first person to do comparative anatomy. Like the Egyptians and Greeks before him, he placed the seat of mentation and sensation in the heart, which is an obvious bad error, which will have to be overcome. And at the time, the vascular system was thought to be a system of dead-end channels. That is, you have vessels going from the heart and dead-ending into the tissues where the nutrients were absorbed. And then the venous system was completely separate without any capillary connections and returned waste back the other way. Capillaries would have to wait over 2,000 years to be discovered, and we'll talk about that. Let me say there was a bit of confusion, and it's really based on what happens when you dissect a dead animal or human, as y'all know from doing your cadaveric dissections. When you cut open an artery, it's not filled with blood, it's filled with air, because the blood seeps out into the venous system. And so you'll remember that the arteries were hollow. This was a point of confusion for these guys, and there was this principle called pneuma, which is with a P in, which is where we get a lot of our adjectives for the lung and breathing and so forth. And it was described as the vital principle. So you take in pneuma, which is distributed through the blood vessels to the body, and that's how you get movement, that's how you get life throughout your body. So that's going to have to be overcome in the future. I want to read you, since we have Aristotle here, there's no reason to listen to me go on about him. We'll listen to him describe some of his own findings. Bear with me, it's just a paragraph. He says, "The windpipe lies in front of the esophagus, although this position causes it to be some hindrance to the latter in the act of deglutition. For if a morsel of food, fluid or solid, slips into it by accident, choking and much distress and violent fits of coughing ensue. To obviate this, however, nature has contrived the epiglottis." Precursor of evolution, doesn't say Zeus caused the epiglottis. He says, "Nature has contrived the epiglottis. This part is not found in all sanguineous animals, but only in such of them as have a lung, nor in all of these, but only in such as at the same time have their skin covered with hairs. In scaly and feathered animals there is no epiglottis, but its function is supplied by the larynx, which closes and opens, just as in the other case the epiglottis falls down and rises up. So admirably contrived is the movement of the epiglottis, that while the food is passing over it, seldom does a particle of it slip into the windpipe." Now let me show you why it's reasonable to discuss these people in terms of the life of Alexander the Great. This is the Greek sphere of influence before Alexander's conquests. And this is the Greek world after Alexander. Let me remind you of a series of connections of important people. Socrates, the great philosopher, taught Plato, who taught Aristotle, who tutored Alexander the Great during his childhood. Alexander conquered much of the known world, and in the process founded the city of Alexandria on the Nile Delta. Alexander's lifelong friend and fellow general named Ptolemy took charge of the Egyptian part of the Alexandrian conquest when Alexander died. And Ptolemy and Ptolemy's sons started this Greek regime in Egypt. This is the regime that built these are the men that built the library at Alexandria. Also the men who built the seventh wonder of the ancient world, the lighthouse at Alexandria, which was the third tallest building after the Great Pyramids until the 1300s, when it was surpassed by a building in England and also destroyed by a series of earthquakes. But this regime loved science, they loved research, and let me give you some examples. Let me give you this example about how much they loved research and books. If you were a merchant and you sailed into the Alexandrian port, you were boarded by the Egyptian authorities, and your ship was by force searched for books. The books were taken by force to the library, and if you wanted to leave with your books, you had to wait for them to be copied at the library, and you could leave with the copies of the books. The originals stayed in Alexandria. So this is the society that these two great figures worked in. The Alexandrian anatomist Herophilus, known as the father of anatomy, and Erasistratus, known as the father of physiology. Erasistratus was a little bit younger, but these men did work together under the laboratories that were incorporated into the research center that was with the library. Herophilus made basic discoveries in every system in the body. Certainly, he made discoveries that were more numerous than we know. Many of his writings were lost. Actually, we have only snippets from other people's works. We don't have any of his original work. He was the inventor of autopsy. He was the first to dissect humans, and he was the first to vivisect humans. Now remember, this Greek regime is in Egypt, where there weren't necessarily those social taboos that the Greeks had to deal with earlier. Plus, it's a regime that is really gung-ho about research. So they're willing to forget about some of these religious taboos. And these people were allowed to dissect humans. And controversially, at the time and thereafter, they actually took criminals and dissected them while living to discover some of the physiologic functions that obviously you can't learn after death. That was rather short-lived, and people were horrified only 100 or 200 years later, but that's how they made a lot of their discoveries. While you read this list of structures named by Herophilus, I'm going to read you a list of important discoveries, and I hate to read lists, but I think this is important enough that it's worth doing. He was the first to differentiate between nerves, ligaments, and tendons. He was the first to assign the nerves the function of carrying nerve impulses. He demonstrated that nerves originate in the brain, and he demonstrated the difference between motor and sensory nerves. He said that damage to the motor nerves causes paralysis, whereas malfunction of the nerves causes tremor. He states that the brain initiates voluntary motion, and he was the first to place the center of consciousness in the brain. He describes the ventricles, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the spinal cord, the meninges. He explains the meninges' function, especially the arachnoid. He differentiated between cranial and spinal nerves. He describes the ciliary body, the vitreous humor. He distinguishes between arteries and veins and says that arteries carry blood, not air, to the body, and that veins drain the blood back to the heart. He describes the venous sinuses. He's the first to accurately describe the liver and pancreas. He's the first to accurately describe the male and female reproductive systems. He is the first to recognize that spermatozoa, which he named, comes from testes. He describes the course of egress. That is, he describes the epididymis, the vas deferens, seminal vesicles, and the prostate, which he named. He was also the first person to give women equal credit in procreation. It was thought up to that point that men provided the seed and women were the incubators. Herophilus was the first person to describe ovaries. He stated that the ovaries produce their own seed, and that through the uterine tubes, as he called them, that the female seed enters the uterus, where it's joined with sperm and where the fetus starts to grow. Obviously, the only mistake here is that usually the sperm meets the egg in the fallopian tubes. So, that's not too bad. Also describes the salivary glands and describes lymphatic vessels. That knowledge about lymphatics is lost for about 1900 years and is rediscovered after the Renaissance, and we'll talk about that in a little while. The father of physiology is Erasistratus, depicted here by Jacques-Louis David. I can't go into this anecdote which is being portrayed, maybe later if there's time, but this describes an anecdote which made him famous. Erasistratus was the grandson of Aristotle. He completely rejected humoral theory. He said there's nothing to it. He is most famous for his discoveries in cardiac anatomy and physiology. He describes the cardiac valves and the subvalvular complexes and demonstrates experimentally how they create unidirectional flow. He's also the first person to give a detailed anatomic description of the chambers of the heart. Unfortunately, and we're not exactly sure why, he returned to the idea that arteries carry the pneuma, the life's breath, rather than blood, and that idea would persist for some time. But he did further describe CNS structures, and he said that the brain functions as the center of consciousness, intellect, and emotion. He was also the first person to state that there's an essential connection between the respiratory system and the vascular system. And some people think that some of his writings suggest the existence of capillaries, but the credit of that discovery does not go to him. In the larger Greco-Roman world that came to be, although Romans dominated politically, the Greeks dominated intellectually and culturally. If you were an aristocrat who had a son who was academically promising, he was sent to Greece. And the Greeks were the people who were dispersed throughout the empire. They were the teachers, they were the philosophers, they were the physicians. So the intellectual dominance was certainly Greek. Probably the greatest of all the physicians of the Greek world and of the Roman world was Galen, who served as the court physician to Marcus Aurelius. He was a compiler of works, an experimenter. He was a philosopher outside of science. He was, of course, a teacher. He summarized and evaluated and criticized his predecessors and his contemporaries and made a lot of enemies doing that. And he also described his own experimental and clinical research, and he really synthesized all the knowledge that had come before him and that he came about on his own. Most of the Galenic writings are lost. That being said, literally half of all the extant Greek literature we have, half of it is Galen. So he was a prolific writer. Really, in the 4,000-year history of medicine, he's often considered the great hero. During the fall of the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages, he was sort of the lonely pillar of knowledge that stood for 1,000 years while people in the West weren't making much progress. As a matter of fact, his works were considered perfect and studied not religiously, but almost with that sort of fervor, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. He did not dissect humans. His knowledge on human anatomy came from the Alexandrian writers, and he also dissected animals, mostly primates, mostly macaques, although he did not vivisect monkeys because of how horrible that was to watch. He did vivisect pigs, and his favorite experiment was to get in front of the auditorium, isolate the spinal cord, and describe what would happen when he made transections superiorly and more superiorly and more superiorly, and people could see what stopped working as he cut at different levels. That was his favorite thing to do. He re-espoused humoral theory, probably unfortunately, and really was the cause of that being carried forth into, for the next 1,500 years into Europe. I'm going to read you a paragraph from one of Galen's works on the musculoskeletal system. He says, "The psoas begins at the 11th rib. The inside part is attached through a strong fascia to the inner surface of the ischion, at that place especially where the pubic bone begins and the ilium ends, and receives the iliacus from the ilium. Thereafter, both having become united into one through a strong, slightly flat tendon, it is inserted into the small trochanter of the femur, grasping the whole periphery of it. This muscle flexes the whole thigh and rotates it more externally by the above-mentioned trochanter." So, that's pretty sophisticated stuff. I'm going to move to the fall of Rome. Aided by large-scale barbarian invasions from the east, there's really a collapse of the Western European government, economy, educational system, and there's a subsequent religious clampdown to try to maintain some semblance of order amidst the chaos. This leaves the Eastern Roman Empire, come to be known as the Byzantine Empire or Byzantium, as the inheritors of the traditions of the entire Roman Empire. Of course, this is still the Greek world. The major language spoken here is Greek and not Latin and so forth. But the Byzantines really clung to the Galenic teachings and didn't make much progress as far as an improvement in understanding. So we're going to leave the Byzantines. And we're going to move to the real inheritors of the Greco-Roman tradition, which is Islam. During the 7th century AD, the Islamic world spread out of the Middle East, as you see, all the way across Africa into Spain. It quickly, very quickly, swept over the Greek-speaking world and gained the population as well as the knowledge that was housed in those places. The greatest physician and philosopher of the time is Avicenna, as he's known in the West, Ibn al-Sina in Arabic. And he lived around the turn of the millennium. He was not just a physician and a philosopher. He was an astronomer, a chemist, a geologist, a logician, paleontologist, mathematician, physicist, poet, psychologist, sheikh, soldier, statesman, teacher, and theologian. Really one of the great minds in the history of the world. In 1025, he completed his Canon of Medicine textbook, which was the standard textbook in the Islamic world and in Europe as late as the 17th century. Obviously, he was a prolific writer on so many things, but for our purposes, he describes the optic chiasm. He also describes the cerebellar vermis and the caudate nucleus, which he named. He called it the tailed nucleus, hence caudate. He also was the person to say that the frontal lobe of the brain mediates common sense and reasoning. There were many more Islamic scholars that were great that I can't talk about due to time. We'll talk a little bit about two of the best. Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Al-Hasan, also lived around the turn of the millennium. He wrote a book of optics in which he studied optical physics as well as an incredible study of the anatomy of the eye, almost to micro-anatomic levels. It's really an incredible thing to read. He also theorized about how the visual image is transferred from the eyes through the optic nerves into the brain. Ibn al-Nafis lived in the 13th century AD, and he should be, although is often not, should be thought of as the person who describes the pulmonary circulation, and he postulated the existence of capillaries. Sometimes that credit goes to a guy from Europe, but it happened a couple hundred years later, and it's mostly because some of al-Nafis's work was destroyed, and I think the guy in Europe, whose name, by the way, was Michael Servetus or Miguel Cerveto, he was actually Spanish, maybe independently did come up with it, but it was a couple hundred years after Ibn al-Nafis. Now, he was also the first person to say that the coronary vessels, not the blood pool in the cardiac chambers, supplied the nutrients to the myocardium. I'm going to have to leave the Islamic world, but I will say that much of the knowledge of the Islamic world was transmitted to Western Europe. They really jump-started the Western Europeans after what Petrarch called the Dark Ages. The Crusades were instrumental in that. The Crusades brought these people together, not always in nice ways, but there was definitely a transmission of information because of the Crusades. As an example of this, I want to talk about this image. We have this peculiarly situated figure. There is some sort of let me say first that all of the anatomic treatises, medical treatises, were prose. There was very, very little illustration. This is one of the very few illustrations. So we have this thing in the center of the chest, perhaps the heart, maybe there are some vessels emanating from it. There is this spiraling or coiling of bowel and this peculiar position. It's sort of a memorable figure. Now we're going to move to Europe. Is this the same figure? It has this same central heart sort of thing with vessels emanating from it, spiraling bowel, a liver, maybe a little green gallbladder, a spleen in the left upper quadrant. Now, let me say that we shouldn't take these images too literally as demonstrations of how sophisticated these people's anatomic knowledge was. It should be clear that in Islam, the depiction of the human body was considered improper, so a degree of stylization and abstraction was necessary. Also, in medieval Europe, artists seemed more interested in depicting relationships rather than the strict detail we've come to expect. Anatomic understanding was transmitted through documents and some people, mostly to the universities of Europe. Universities like Paris, Pavia in Italy, Oxford and Cambridge. And it is not true that the church out and out prohibited dissections. Dissections did continue, though at a very slow pace, and this is the reason why. It was thought that the understanding of human anatomy came from the tireless study of Galenic texts, not through dissection. As a matter of fact, there were physicians, professors, anatomists at the major universities, specifically at the University of Paris in the Middle Ages and beyond, who considered that any alteration in their particular anatomic specimen from which did not match up with the Galenic teachings was due to the degeneration of humanity through sin that had occurred over the last 1,000 years. So it's a little bit of a speed bump to get over, but we got over it eventually. Progress continued, though. An Italian named Mondino in the 13th century described the mammillary bodies and further described the cranial nerves, and also gave us our modern parlance about the segmentation of the bowel. He didn't name duodenum, that was Herophilus, but he differentiated between jejunum, ileum. He said there's a cecum, an ascending colon, a transverse colon, and so forth. So a little progress is being made. In 1494, we have the first illustrated medical work published. Now this is, of course, a couple generations after the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg. So this is really the most anatomic of any of the plates. Obviously, there's a female urogenital system here, however flawed. You know, there are probably some kidneys and maybe some ureters or vessels. Obviously, uterus and adnexi. Leaves a lot to be desired. The other plates, incidentally, have to do with astrology and different things like that. So it's not incredibly sophisticated. A few years later, in 1501, Magnus Hunt publishes his Anthropologium. Let's look at some of these things. We have some surface anatomy with a bunch of words that, if translated into English, you would recognize. Up here we have, obviously, an unimpressive description of the heart along with the capsula cordis, the pericardium, and we have these vascular structures. This term, the venae arterialis, the arterialized veins is a term that comes from Herophilus and Erasistratus as trying to describe the pulmonary vasculature, in particular the pulmonary artery as an arterialized vein. Below here we have a liver. It says de hepate, as in hepatic. We have the portal vein, the vena chilis, which is what the inferior vena cava was called. And on the right we have this figure of the situation of the viscera. Lungs, maybe some fissures, a trachea, maybe this is an esophagus coming down here to a stomach, bowel, spleen, liver, maybe this is a gallbladder, maybe some urogenital things happening in the right lower quadrant. I'm not sure what that is. But we have got, at least we have somewhere to go. Next comes the Renaissance, and if anyone besides Leon and Dr. Oliphant can tell me the name of this, I'll buy you a beer at First Street after work. I'm going to talk, I can't go over what happened in the Renaissance during this lecture. That's not good enough, Dr. Elstra. So, suffice it to say, it does start with an L. Who said that? All right, Dr. Bettman and I are going out for beer. Laocoon. He was a Trojan priest that they talk about in Aeneid. Anyway, suffice it to say about the Renaissance that there was a rediscovery of and rekindling of interest in classical culture, science, art, literature, philosophy, etc. And there was a reinvigorated interest in humanism as opposed to religion. The artists became anatomists by necessity as they tried to replicate figures, lifelike figures such as these, which were carved in Hellenistic times, back in the Greco-Roman times. And what the artists also did is they pioneered a systematic vocabulary of anatomy by which any progress could be recorded. So that was absolutely critical. Certainly the greatest of all the artist anatomists was Leonardo da Vinci, who in 1489 undertook these illustrations of the human skull. He used his architectural knowledge and designing knowledge to create this paradigm of plan, section, elevation, and perspective that became the standard in medical illustration. His really exquisite and most accurate anatomic drawings were completed under the supervision of a young professor of anatomy at the University of Pavia in 1510 and 1511. Really some incredible stuff here. Now these are not without error. In particular, take a look at the image on the left. There's no communication between the venous system and the arterial system, but it's a remarkable step forward compared to just a few years earlier. His way of illustrating the musculature in layers also became the new paradigm, and that was incorporated into the first comprehensively illustrated Renaissance anatomic treatise by this man, Andreas Vesalius, who in 1543 published his De Humani Corporis Fabrica, that is, on the makeup of the human body. The famous American neurosurgeon Dr. Cushing wrote this. He said that the year 1543 is memorable for the appearance of two books, one of which altered the course of human thought in regard to the macrocosm, the other in regard to man himself. Each of them was written by a doctor of medicine. With his On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres, Copernicus, at a stroke, dethroned the Aristotelian theory of a fixed and immovable world. With Vesalius's work, Galen was dethroned, opening the way for the modern study of anatomy. This is a quote from Galileo, and it encompasses the new way of thinking about the world that really started again in the Renaissance. Galileo says, "A small truth is better than a great lie. It is more estimable to find out the truth, even in an insignificant detail, than to speculate extensively on the highest problems without a positive and definite result. Think of the wrath that brings from the church, of course, and Galileo was excommunicated for a number of things, and I'm sure that quote didn't help him. But this is the spirit that characterizes the new scientific understanding in the Renaissance, and it's the spirit in which this work by Vesalius is right to be counted as one of the great scientific works in the history of Europe. It's certainly as important to the history of anatomy as Galileo's and Copernicus's work was to the physical sciences. Let's take a look at a few plates from Vesalius. You can definitely see Leonardo's influence on the musculoskeletal drawings here. Here are some images of male and female urogenital tracts. Note in particular the relation to the sculptured torsos of the classical world, in particular the Belvedere torso, which is probably a 1st century AD copy of a 2nd century BC original by an Athenian. It's now housed in the Vatican Museum. How many Belvedere torsos can we see in Michelangelo's The Last Judgment? There's like 100 or 150 or something. Here's one up close. I would really love to dwell on the Belvedere torso's influence on the subsequent history of art, and particular mannerism, but I got to go back to anatomy. Really, the work of Vesalius was the beginning of the end, as the pace of description and definition and standardization just accelerated. Let's remind ourselves of where we've come from in just a few years. There's Magnus Hunt in 1501 and Andreas Vesalius 1543, and of course the giant standing between them is Leonardo da Vinci. Next we move on into what I call the age of eponyms. There's just an incredible acceleration in progress of discoveries and rediscoveries and an understanding. William Harvey in 1616 proposes the existence of capillaries and also proposes the correct modern theory of systemic and pulmonary circulation. Gasparo Aselli rediscovers those lymphatic vessels that Herophilus discovered about 300 BC. Doctors Eustachi and Falloppio are working, and there are any number of people that I could talk about now, but I can't go on forever. This is an image of the urogenital system, and in particular the lymphatic drainage, thanks to Dr. Nuck and Dr. Oliphant who gave me this slide. Of course, the progress wasn't limited to Europe. With the printing press and colonialization and so forth, we have transmission of information all throughout the world. This is a German author's publication in Japanese from 1774 with an impressive illustration of the dorsum of the hand. And finally we reach the 19th century, where descriptive gross anatomy is really finalized and systematized. This is a French work and not outstanding in any of its descriptions or drawings. This is where we've come to in the 19th century. Incidentally, I have my own 1887 edition of Gray's Anatomy, which is particularly interesting because it has the first chapter. It's the first edition with a chapter about the cell that everybody's free to look at gently afterwards if you want to. Another thing that happens in the 19th century, started with the Anatomy Act of 1832 in England, was that there was legislation that provided for an increased number of cadavers, thanks to the homeless population. Homeless people who died were allowed to be dissected, so you have large numbers of cadavers available. And you have a shift from prosection, in which somebody in an auditorium does some dissection and a bunch of people are watching, to dissection in small groups like we have done. And of course, the knowledge just spread more and more rapidly with the foundation of more and more medical schools. And as they say, the rest is history. Those are my references. And can I take some questions? Yes, Dr. DeSantis. It obviously comes later, and I was sort of, we don't, as this is sort of a radiologic talk, I was sticking with gross anatomy just because that's what we deal with. The microscope, came during the 1600s, I think, at least as a workable tool. And, obviously this was the time after which there was a vocabulary that allowed the propagation and finalization of terms. So, that's a whole lecture on into itself. Leon?
I wonder if you overstated the significance of those two illustrations, one from Islam and then one from Islam. I think if you look at the history of map making, as Bell mentioned, Europe and Asia,
I was trying more to, I wasn't trying to dwell on the correctness or incorrectness of the anatomy, but rather the similarities between the two, and that as a demonstration of the flow of information from one culture to another. Justin. I don't know what we know. I know nothing. I have no idea. Anybody else? Thanks for coming.